Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here. Hope you guys are all having a great Christmas. Welcome back to my video game review series. So today is Christmas, and those of you who have been following my channel since last year will know that last Christmas I started a new tradition on the channel. I'm going to be reviewing a Christmas themed video game. Last time we looked at the Polar Express movie license game for the PS2. Today we're going to be looking at another movie license game, Die Hard Trilogy for the PS1, released in 1996. Developed by Fox Interactive and Acclaim Studios London. Based of course on the Die Hard movie trilogy from the late 80s and early 90s, starring Bruce Willis. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys about the original Die Hard movie. It's generally regarded as one of the greatest Christmas movies of all time, and yes, it is a Christmas movie. As well as one of the greatest action movies of all time. It's a timeless classic and one that I watch pretty much every year around Christmas time. As far as the sequels, whereas I don't think they're necessarily terrible movies or anything like that. I just think if I'm being perfectly frank, they weren't really necessary. The first Die Hard movie was a perfectly fine standalone movie that really didn't need to be a franchise, and I just think it was fine as it was, but I digress. As far as the video game goes, it had a bit of a chaotic development cycle, being originally developed as 3 separate games, with the publisher later making the decision to make it 3 games on the one disc, and for it to be sold as a trilogy. Despite being technically based on the first 3 Die Hard movies, the game really doesn't follow either of the movies' narratives at all. In fact, there is pretty much no story to speak of. The game is basically split up into 3 modes, each of them based on one of the movies. The first is a third-person shooter with an isometric view that consists of John McClane shooting his way through each floor of Nakatomi Plaza, taking out waves and waves of terrorists and rescuing hostages. The second is a first-person on-rail shooter that consists of John McClane taking on waves of terrorists in an airport, looking to rescue the flight like in the movie. The third is a driving game. Here you basically drive around New York City defusing bombs with a time limit. Each of the 3 modes are extremely fast-paced and full of action, with very little story or dialogue. So if you're looking for more of a story-based, narrative-driven game, then this game really isn't for you. The game is more of a traditional arcade experience rather than what would nowadays be imagined from a home console game, with no save feature between levels and absolutely brutal difficulty, at least in some levels. If you fail and run out of lives, you get a game over and have to start again, arcade style. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, this made me want to rage quit several times while playing for this review, but I'll get to that later. So I mentioned how the first one is a third-person shooter. You start the game off in the garage area of Nakatomi Plaza, and John McClane begins by blasting away a horde of terrorists. This introduces you to pretty much all the game mechanics you have to expect. You get a health meter and 2 extra lives. You start with John's signature pistol that has unlimited ammo, and you'll be relying on it for the majority of the game. By exploring the levels, you can find several useful items that can be obtained, such as more powerful weapons with limited ammo, such as machine guns, shotguns, and even an explosive shotgun. These are badass. As well as health and armor pickups, and even explosives, such as grenades and flashbangs, that can be very useful against large groups of enemies. There are also several hostages that can be found and rescued throughout the game. As you defeat enemies and rescue hostages, you will gain points. The more enemies you defeat, and the more hostages you save, the higher your score will be at the end of each level. The levels get progressively harder as the game goes on. Each floor will be populated with breakable environments and plenty of corners to hide behind and use as cover. You get a minimap in the corner of the screen that gives you directions and points out where the enemies and hostages are, as well as some of the pickups dropped by enemies. You can avoid enemy attacks by staying mobile and utilising the side roll mechanic. It's extremely difficult to get used to early on, but as you play through the game, you will get used to it and it does become easier eventually. In certain levels you get to fight a boss, and if you defeat the boss you can unlock a prize such as a new weapon or even an extra life. In between some levels you also have a bonus level which will take place on the roof of Nakatomi Plaza. These basically consist of saving hostages and clearing a way for them to get to the chopper to escape. These levels are boring and pointless if truth be told. One really annoying feature with the game is that at the end of each level, once all the enemies have been defeated, a bomb will activate and you will have to quickly reach the end of the level to deactivate it. You only get 30 seconds to do this, and if you were on the other side of the map, you basically have no chance. I don't know if any of you guys had this problem, but for me this caused me to lose several lives and I had to restart the game because of it. It made me want to rage quit at times. Again, I don't know if this was a problem for everybody or if I just suck at the game, but I digress. Other than that, the game is fine for what it is and it's quite fun, but if truth be told it's quite repetitive and about midway through it starts to get very tedious. If you have a lot of experience with modern day third person shooters, then this won't have anything to offer you, so be aware about that. This game is very old and in many ways it hasn't aged well. But to be fair, that's to be expected for a game released in 1996. As far as the second one goes, again, I mentioned before it's a first-person on-rail shooter, loosely based on the second movie. Just like the first, there's really no story. John McClane is basically a mass murderer who blasts his way through waves and waves of terrorists and tries to save hostages, while this time mostly blowing them up since they get in the way and are almost impossible to save. It'll get to the point where you stop even trying. The game basically plays like an old school retro arcade shooter that drains all your quarters, except it's a lot easier than your average quarter muncher. You start the game with several extra lives and can gain more by shooting various pickups. In addition to that, by shooting enemies with McClane's handgun, you can unlock several other weapons, some of which are the same as in the first game, such as machine guns, shotguns and even the explosive shotgun, which makes it practically impossible to save the hostages. There's a bit more level and location variety here, and it plays much better than the first. You start off in an airport, and later on you even get to take part in a snowmobile chase, and even a helicopter ride. It's actually a lot more fun than the first in my opinion, despite being more simplistic. The shooting mechanics are fine, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Being relatively short, and as I mentioned before, it's a bit more varied and less repetitive than the first. I had fun with it for what it was. You also take on bosses named Head Honchos, and these enemies are slightly tougher than regular enemies. And just like the bosses in the first, they will drop useful items and weapons. This is also the only game out of the three that actually has a Christmas theme, despite the fact that the first Die Hard is famously set on Christmas, which I found quite strange. The snowy weather helps to give it a Christmassy vibe, and I really like that. I'm not saying it's a great game or anything like that, because it certainly isn't, but I just enjoyed it for what it was. It's a retro shooter and a pretty decent one at that. As far as the third game goes, as I mentioned earlier, it's a driving game. You once again play as John McClane as he and his friend, who was Samuel L. Jackson's character from the movie, drive around New York, stopping terrorists and defusing bombs. For some reason you defuse the bombs by driving into them and setting them off early. Yeah, it doesn't make much sense, but it is what it is. You basically get a little red arrow on a compass in the corner of your screen that shows you the general direction of the target. And to help you out, Samuel will tell you when to turn and which direction to turn to help you to get there faster. This usually helps a lot, but can be misleading on occasion. You will alternate between defusing bombs placed around the city and chasing and blowing up cars by ramming into them. Between levels you will often change vehicles, and there are even some levels that take place in the subway, where you have to race another vehicle to the end. In several of the levels you can find turbo boosts, as well as items that give you more time to complete your objectives. I have to be honest with you guys and just be straight, I absolutely hated this part of the game. First of all, the graphics are so bad, and the driving mechanics are so broken, that the game actually gave me motion sickness. It's actually so hard to get through a single level without feeling nauseous, or at least being extremely frustrated. Usually graphics in old games don't bother me, and it's not something I have a tendency to criticise because you have to take into consideration the technical limitations of the time. But if truth be told, this part of the game looks absolutely disgusting, and the terrible graphics are put on really focused display here. The game is marred with clipping and collision detection problems, the steering and handling is completely broken, and the AI is absolutely atrocious, with enemy vehicles acting really stupid, sharp turns being way too dramatic and self-defeating, an absolutely unforgivable time limit that is clearly designed to artificially extend the game length, and to top it off, some of the worst and most nonsensical level design I have ever experienced in my entire life. Honestly, if I was rating this game purely on the Die Hard 3 feature, I would legit give it a 1 out of 10, it's really that bad, I couldn't stand it. In fact, I hated it so much that I didn't even finish it. Like I said, not only did I hate it, but it made me feel physically sick, so I had no reason to finish it. There are so many scripted cheat deaths, and so many unfair time limits that, in a game like this, just don't make any sense. Really poor driving game, I do not recommend it. So to sum up the trilogy of games, the first is a competent and fun, yet in some ways tedious and repetitive, isometric third-person shooter, with some interesting ideas and a welcome challenge, but not really much replay value or content to offer. The second is a pretty short yet fun and interesting third-person rail shooter, with a Christmassy theme and some level and location variety, but again not really that much replay value or content. And the third is an absolutely terrible driving game that is one of the worst games I've ever played, and never even bothered to finish it, which is very rare for me. It's worth pointing out that it's a movie license game, but at the same time, the game did have several teams working on it, and despite having a chaotic development cycle, using the Die Hard license was a massive opportunity to make more of a story-based game, with some dialogue and choices, maybe even some stealth mechanics. Maybe I'm asking for too much for a game released in 1996, and I can see that argument, but at the same time there were plenty of great games from around about that time that honestly had way more to offer than this. The little voice acting the game has to offer is embarrassingly bad, with a voice actor, a guy called Eric Allen Baker, doing a laughable impression of Bruce Willis as John McClane, and his one-liners are so bad that they're good.
NYPD! Hey, this isn't even my jurisdiction!
So that's pretty much all I have to say about the Die Hard trilogy on the original PlayStation. It's a very basic and pretty limited game, even for its time. But the first two games in the trilogy are fun despite being simplistic, and although I had fun with them, I probably wouldn't want to replay them anytime soon. The third game is terrible and I couldn't stand it, so it detracts from the score. I give the game a generous 4 out of 10. It's weird because based on the research I've done, this game seems to be very well liked, and the general consensus on the internet seems to be that it's a genuine classic. And there's no doubt that in 1996, this would have seemed a lot more technically sound than it does today. But if truth be told, playing the game in retrospect, I'm wondering if most of that is down to nostalgia. Because as far as I'm concerned, the game is just not very well made. It has a very cheap and generic feel to it, and I was a bit disappointed. I think a 4 out of 10 is a fair score, but that's just my opinion. Thanks for watching, guys. I had a lot of fun checking out the Die Hard trilogy for the PS1, even if the game isn't as great as it's often made out to be in my opinion. Once again, I hope you guys are all having a great Christmas, praise be to our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, and I hope to see you guys in my next video. In the new year we're going to have a lot of content coming to the channel, including continuing several of the review series playlists. Thanks for watching, yippee-ki-yay, and God bless.